Hello and welcome back. I'm Eric Nentrup with the EdSafe Artificial Intelligence Alliance. A core piece of the ESA's work centers around the SAFE benchmarks framework. And on today's episode, we're focusing on the topic of fairness as it applies to artificial intelligence in education technology. This topic has particular relevance for how learning experience design affects students and requires support across all constituent groups in the field. And to further this discussion, I am joined by some fantastic guests today. Mr. Steve Ritter, founder and chief scientist at Carnegie Learning, and Michael Gamrell from the Alliance's sustaining member RID Labs, as well as serving as the Alliance's business development lead. And without further ado, let me introduce you to both Michael and to Steve. Michael and Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure.
Thanks for having us, Eric.
My pleasure. So to get us started, I like to ask my guests to tell us a little bit of background story first. How in the world did you get to the Alliance? But then if you can also comment on how you started your career in the education field and whether or not that was involving some classroom or administration time yourselves. So let's start with you, Michael. Tell us about how you came to be involved with the Alliance.
Sure. I've been in education for 30 years now and dealing mainly with test preparation, assessments, and college and career readiness. When I started working with RID, an AI enablement company, the technology piece applied to education was, of course, a very interesting facet for me. And ultimately, that's what takes it back to this concept of fairness, because you want to make sure that there is that access. And if technology is going to be this great equalizer, well, then we want to make sure that that technology doesn't actually backfire and create more unfairness.
Absolutely. Well said. And Steve, how about yourself? How did you get to be involved with the Alliance? And before that, how did you get into education and how long ago was it?
Yeah, so I got into education almost unintentionally. I have background in cognitive psychology, studying how people think and learn. And I was working with John Anderson, and he was challenged by people who said, well, if you understand how well people think and learn, why can't you apply that to education? And so it really became kind of a proof of a basic psychological theory to be able to see whether it worked in the real world outside of the lab. And that was the beginning of what we called at the time cognitive tutors, and now is the basis for Mathia, our system. And as far as the Alliance, one of the principles behind the cognitive psychology that we bring to instruction is the idea that knowledge builds on prior knowledge. And so that inherently means that you need to personalize, that different people are going to relate to different things because they have different backgrounds, different interests. And so you need to kind of consider everyone's interest. And there's a really inspiring quote from Benjamin Bloom back in the 1970s when he was defining what mastery learning is, which is one of the principles that we use, the idea that you need to master the prerequisites before you move on. And he said that most students become very similar with regard to learning ability, rate of learning, and motivation for learning when provided with favorable learning conditions. And I think that's a great definition of fairness, is that our objective is to provide every student with the conditions that that student needs to succeed.
Yes, and now we need to teach the models and groom the data sets such that they kind of point in that same direction. Is that an accurate way of sort of taking your cognitive science background there applied to education and delegating it to technology?
Yeah, definitely. We need to make sure that AI models, people think AI models are sort of somehow inherently unbiased sometimes, but those models are trained based on data examples of student performance or other inputs. It's the job of the model builder to ensure that that model gets a broad enough range of experience that it's going to support each individual student.
Very good. Well, if you guys will indulge me with a leading question here, hearing your stories, your backgrounds, and thinking of my own, it's interesting to think as a former classroom teacher and administrator that I was reliant upon technology vendors and curriculum companies for convenience, right? I had materials that would help students move towards mastery in given content areas, developing certain particular skills. And then there would be a formative assessment of sorts where Michael, you were particularly involved in your prior work. So it's interesting to me that I feel between two bookends talking to both of you about that. And when I think about my historical self entering the profession, fairness for me meant fairness was very, very much an in front of me kind of thing. It wasn't a theoretical thing. It was, are the conditions fair in this particular classroom for engaging in this learning activity or approaching this high stakes assessment, right? So of all the priorities that the three of us could discuss today, I know that by intent, we're talking about fairness, but why should the Alliance prioritize fairness and work on spreading the message that fairness is one of our priorities, as far as you two are concerned, from your particularly interesting but complementary posts and experiences? Why fairness?
Well, that's a good question.
All the priorities.
Yeah, I think that, given my background and we talk about fairness, it related more for me personally to this access, right? Steve's talking about learning conditions and are there optimal learning conditions? And of course, there are too many examples of students having to go to schools or classrooms that were ill-equipped, or maybe these were students who didn't even have a meal. So now they're going to school hungry. And you've got lots of different things, policy changes that helps to, again, equalize things. But now in this world of technology, and you heard me say earlier, right, technology could be this great equalizer. But if we're not careful, it could actually have this effect of further entrenching some things that were unfair, right? Steve mentioned how ultimately these models are going to be trained. Well, then what data are we using, and who isn't being represented in that data? Because I saw that firsthand with these different assessments. There weren't students even taking some of these assessments so that their data wasn't then put into the pool. Not to mention the fact that maybe some students who were taking some of these assessments were just horribly ill-prepared for lots of different reasons. And so I think we can look at it from a few different ways, but ultimately kind of go, okay, well, who's not represented, but of course should be represented when we are very deliberate about grabbing data for the use of training a model.
Yeah, and that is a very good setup, I think, for Steve to respond when it comes to particularly a jargony part of this in terms of talking about like algorithmic bias. When we talk about the ways that things could be predestined for unfairness with the advent of certain technologies, I'd like to hear more about that from you, Steve, and what your perspective has been studying that and implementing it too.
Sure. Yeah, we were lucky enough to receive a grant from the National Science Foundation to work with University of Illinois and University of Pennsylvania on the first studies that look at algorithmic bias in education. But algorithmic bias is something that's been recognized relatively recently in the AI community. Probably the most famous example is in face detection, where a number of the big AI labs and companies built algorithms to recognize people's faces. And it turned out that they worked better on faces that had light skin than dark skin, right? And that was just, it wasn't an intentional thing. It was just that they often had the attitude that let's just train it on a representative sample of faces. And if there are more white people than black people in the training set, the algorithm will learn to recognize white people better than black people. And it seems almost obvious in retrospect, but it's not at all obvious. And it's just, an example of how we really need to pay attention, exactly what Michael was saying, to each individual student and student group and ensure that our algorithms are fair, are correctly, in the case of education, selecting activities for students and judging students' knowledge and competency in a way that's fair to that student's experience.
You talk about that being a fairly mainstream example, and I do think it is. I think a lot of folks know good and well that are paying attention, whether they're professional educators or not, that there is bias in that capacity. even outside of the ways that it's applied in our field. Other devices with different sensors, hand washing and hand drying automation, for example, not recognizing skin color because it was inadvertently trained for a particularly narrow data set. When I think about those sorts of pitfalls, I'm curious from either of your perspectives, what are some of the other pitfalls? What are the things that we should be paying attention to that might not be as objectively obvious and relatable, even if you yourself were not victimized by an AI sensor not detecting your skin color, your name, your or some other attribute? What are some other examples that you guys could share with the audience today where algorithmic bias might be something that we need to put some more clearly defined edges on for the sake of promoting fairness?
I think I may have an example here. If we make the conscious effort to include all these different groups or stakeholders, we also need to take a second to say, well, is the data itself from this group or these groups, is it really representative? And to explain myself, I remember coming up against a lot of difficulty with students from inner city kids, poor socioeconomic backgrounds, and the test had a question about a sailing regatta. Well, I don't know about too many kids in the inner city knew what a regatta was. It's a funny word. It's spelled kind of odd, and that could trip someone up. So the good news is we've got their data, right? They're represented, but maybe that's not the best representation because maybe they were given questions like my regatta example that probably had an unintentional bias so that they were maybe left to struggle with that question more than another group. So I think that might also be something that we need to just take a minute to think about.
Steve, care to respond?
And I'd add, yes, a similar context of students with disabilities. So a lot of times algorithms will build in judgments based on response time, for example. And the distribution of response times for students with disabilities who might be using assistive technology may be very different from the distribution of response times for students who are using kind of the standard interfaces. And so it's another thing to take into account. And I'll say on the flip side, one of the nice things about AI-based education is the ability to test these potential biases. So, as Michael was saying, we see biased inputs and outputs all over the education system. We know they exist. They're extremely hard to measure in the analog world, right? You maybe see major test scores, but you don't see the kind of the day-to-day activity within the classroom. But one of the potentials of digital education and AI-based education in particular is that we can actually see second by second, minute by minute, day by day, exactly what's going on in the classrooms, how students are responding, and test our algorithms against a broad range of students and understand whether they're really working for all students.
There's an interesting point to this particular node of the conversation. When we talk about fairness relative to accountability, safety, and efficacy, there's a little bit of taking our own medicine, which is we need to exhibit. I mean, fairness requires empathy in order to get to equity, I suppose, would be a good way to summarize that quickly. And I think that also applies to the technology and those that are building it. Like that, we need to presume that a lot of folks want to get their products into an equitable position and eliminate blind spots in their code, and that it's going to take some time to get there. How should parents, students, and as well as teachers and administrators exhibit patience and understanding and empathy for those that are building the tools that they use? And I think I know where I want to take this conversation next, but there's something interesting there that I'd like to hear from you if there's a response that's conjured by the positioning that we need to be empathetic towards those involved as well. Is that the case, that this is going to take some time to figure out?
Steve?
Yeah, I think it definitely will. And I'll take the other end of it and say, like, the tool builders. So it's funny, early on, there's One of the hard things about building tools in education is everyone's had an education and they use their own personal experience to guide themselves, which you have to do. But on the other hand, your own personal experience might not be the same as the personal experience of the students that you want to reach. And Ken Cadinger, one of Carnegie Learning's co-founders early on, came up with what he claimed it was our mantra: the student is not like me. So just keep reminding yourself that the students are, we were pretty high-end researchers at Carnegie Mellon University. We were well out of middle school, and when we were in middle school, we're generally pretty good students, and so we just had to, that's just a reminder to ourselves that the student's experience is not necessarily what we remember our experience being. And also our experience was quite a while ago. School may be different than we remember.
That's
Sure,
a very, very good point.
Yeah, with technology evolving so rapidly, I mean, what do I know about AI? Well, I don't know it the way some of the AI science team knows it. I certainly have a good understanding of what the opportunities are, and that makes me very, very excited. So, Eric, you talk about, we need empathy. I think we also need to be courageous. We need to be courageous to say, hey, let's not back off on trying to get this to work. And let's also be upfront and honest to say, you know what, this isn't working, or we checked it through that fairness measure that Steve referred to earlier, and it's not performing in a manner that is right, or that is good enough. And so we got to keep going back to it. So I think that because technology is just changing so rapidly, if we're thinking about the right things, I mean, ultimately, Eric, you said, what are parents supposed to be thinking about? What are kids supposed to be thinking about, or teachers? I think the first thing is that we just need to show that we're thinking about this, right? That we're thinking about it, and we're trying our best, and we are going to be open and honest and brave to say we're going for it, but we're not going to get it right the first time. It is going to be an iterative process, but look at what that opportunity might bring. And that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, I think particularly that's a huge advantage of the Alliance, is being able to kind of come together and commit to, because this is a continuous improvement process. It's not something that, you ever say you're done with. It's always going to be a matter of kind of checking and trying to improve and understanding how things are working with the students.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is true whether you're writing code for an app that you have a great idea for, or you're on the receiving end of such an app's ability to get you from point A to point B and learning a content area, for example, or taking an assessment successfully and passing some gateway to head on to what comes next, is whether it's, kindergarten to first grade or post-secondary. And I think that leads us to a really good, last comment from both of you. Let's talk for just a minute apiece here about the promise and forecast a little optimism for getting it right. What are some things that you see from your unique perspectives? Maybe it's informed by your past experiences professionally, or something that you read recently, or anywhere in between. But when you think about getting fairness right, what are some of the outcomes that people can expect?
I see that so many people are involved in this conversation. And that's what has me excited, because before it seemed, and this might not be accurate, but it just seemed that there was just this small group of people talking or championing this concept of fairness. And I find now that it is a huge group. So it's not just the teachers or the students, but now we've got technologists, right? We've got the policy people. We've got everybody coming together, and they're all involved in this conversation. And so that's what really gives me hope. No, we're not going to get it right the first time. We probably won't get it right the second or third time, but we're all having, we're all taking part in the conversation, and we know it's going to take some time, and we're going to be able to see those improvements lead to better outcomes for more and more students. And like I said, that's what makes it really exciting for me.
How about you, Steve?
Yeah. I'll say when we work with our customers, I'm always gratified by how much they care about these kinds of issues. They don't necessarily use the word fairness, but they think about students' sense of belonging in school, whether students feel like school is a place that they fit into, which is an aspect of fairness. They think about cultural relevancy a lot, outside of AI necessarily considerations, but just in their regular teaching practices. They understand that it's their job to explain to students why math, for example, is relevant to their lives or their expected futures. And so I think there's a really great fit with practitioners for this kind of work in fairness.
Agreed. And to Michael's earlier point, I do think that it's a snowball gathering, some momentum heading downhill here when we think about how much more valued it is to have fairness at the center of the conversation and not a byproduct. Well, on that note, we are out of time, but having just barely scratched the surface yet again on what I think is an incredibly interesting component of the benchmarks, one that's not clearly as onerous as accountability. But when we talk about being fair, it's easy to come together and to want to see this sort of stuff happen in the next iteration of some of our favorite tools that we use in classrooms all around the country and the world, for that matter. And the Alliance is right there at the forefront. And we're always looking for new members to join. And I do hope that what Steve and Michael shared with you today was encouraging to see what the Alliance is all about. So Michael, Steve, thank you guys so much for taking time today. Like I said, again, I really do appreciate you doing so.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks,
Absolutely. Oh boy, what a great conversation. I'm so grateful for them joining us today to talk about fairness. In the upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking about efficacy, and maybe after efficacy, we'll talk about a few other topics. There are just so many implications for each of these components of the framework, as we've said, and we want to hear more from engaged members of the Alliance for how this work impacts educators, the students they teach, ed tech developers, and policymakers. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you again soon.